You're tuned in to the Dockmaster Mike radio show, simultaneously cast on the Dockmaster Mike Music Podcast. And my guest today is a artist that is probably more known by the name of his group, Ultrablue, and he's released a number of different albums and has recently made a return to music recording. Everybody, please welcome aboard John Smatla.
Thank you very much.
Let's talk about your group, Ultrablue.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. Really appreciate it. And thanks for your support. So Ultrablue was a project that originally started in the first decade of the 2000s. It was a guitarist in the New York area who was very well known named Dave Stryker and myself. And Dave was and is really happening on the straight ahead mainstream jazz charts. So he wanted to do a contemporary project, but didn't necessarily want to put his name on it. So that's kind of how it started. I did production, wrote a lot of the material, played keyboards and things like that. And the album was picked up on a Euro label and made a little noise. So a few years later, this was 2006 now, I decided to record a new album using the Ultrablue name. And Dave played a guest role this time, and I was in full charge of production and writing. I was also in the teaching world. And though the album did fairly well, we actually made the top 5 on the Amazon Smooth Jazz charts. The record company at the time wanted me to tour, and I was really not in a position to do that because of my teaching obligations. So long story short, I was in the teaching world until 2018. And then my plan was full-time music work. I had always been a musician over the years, but now I wanted to dedicate myself to it 24/7. After the pandemic went by, there were some experiments with some different personnel and some live band situations. And long story short, it got to the point where I said, I think I'm just going to continue writing and doing it all myself, and then I'll hire in the band. So we have sort of a rotation of regular players. They're all top-notch players who do the recordings, and we've actually done a live show recently. But basically, I'm the guy that's writing and producing everything.
So, Ultrablue, your first album is the one that I think everybody probably has when it comes to smooth jazz. That's the one that we have. It's almost like a legacy album now, with as long as it's been out. And then when I received your current music, I was like, oh, shoot. And for some reason, I thought the two were connected together, even though they are. But I didn't realize how far apart there was of a gap when it came to the releases of these albums. And even though it's the same band and same releases, it seems like it's almost like two separate eras, because 20 years in music, the people you played with back then, some of them,
They're gone.
Exactly.
Long time. Yeah.
But here's the thing too, is some of the people you perform with are bona fide stars. Randy Brecker, Nestor Torres has his own channel style of music, and Gabriella Anders, I know she's someone that you're more recently working with. So from your first process, I know that it was more of like almost like a super group. How did everything lead over into where it is now, musically speaking? Like, it went from one group to the next group. What was your processes of keeping the music alive, so to speak?
So you're right. I mean, we went from 2006 to basically 2022, end of the year, before we had a new release. And that's because there really wasn't a group. It was me, and I was just really immersed in the teaching world. I wasn't able to really put myself through the whole process of writing and producing at that point. So I think the answer to your question is just the time that's there meant that there were some changes in personnel. Like, for example, now Kaylee Minucci, who everybody knows from Special Effects probably, has been playing on the last, 15, 20 tunes that we've recorded, and we put out a new EP this year. And we put out about 5 or 6 singles since the end of 2022. And he's been doing a phenomenal job on it. David Mann is just a great, great sax man in the New York area. Plays for Jeff Lorber, plays for, I think he was doing Steve Oliver or somebody like that the other day. Just one of the top cats, and he is great and works with me on most of the tunes. So there's some changes with personnel, but it's very similar to the 2006 album in that I started with the writing and production of everything and then expanded it. I think it's a little bit more live players now, actually, integrated into the music than it maybe was in 06, where it was more program stuff.
Just the people you mentioned, David Mann, I mean, gosh, if I'm not mistaken, I think he's recorded with a couple of current other artists as well. But I mean, God, he played with Madonna, he played with Tower of Power. Again, Kaylee Minucci, Special effects. To me, even the 80s smooth jazz era, actually, that's the true smooth jazz era. 70s
Yeah,
is kind of when it was curated, I think, when it
right.
started really finding its shape. But I think it really picked up steam in the late 80s when you started mixing in some of the digital sounds with the smooth sounds. And some of those bands from the 70s had to adapt. Like Grover Washington Jr., for instance, I'm just giving an example. His music was a lot more analog, and then it switched over into that smooth jazz format. So your
Yeah,
music was definitely a part of that, but special effects were kind of a pioneer in that as well.
yeah, no doubt, and I agree with you. I think the '70s were interesting. I was in high school and graduated in '77, so it gives you an idea how long
Mm.
I've been around. But I was kind of coming into my own in terms of understanding this music, and there was a lot of fusion and things like the Weather Report and some of the explorations that Herbie was doing at that time, and many other groups that were in these more fusiony modes. And then in the '80s, it seemed to be a little bit more focused into more of a pop sensibility. And I'm thinking of some great groups that weren't exactly pop, but were able to be played on stations that were playing smooth jazz. People like Pat Metheny and others like, even Bob James and Foreplay. They did some really great stuff. And obviously some of the legacy bands that were out like Spyro Gyra and so forth. So yeah, I agree with that. And that was the time that I was coming up as a musician, and it influenced me greatly. Everything from straight ahead jazz to the fusion to rock and R&B and everything I was hearing. So I kind of grew up in that area that you described.
I think also too a turning point was maybe 83-ish. I mean, you have Herbie Hancock that went and just recorded that Future Shock album, which totally just
Yeah,
changed, I mean, literally changed everything from like
yeah,
changed the landscape, so to speak. You had Jeff Lorber doing kind of a similar sound. You had Paul Hardcastle. So now these
right.
singular keyboard artists, and it seems like the digital era changed with the synthesizer revolution, so to speak. And so these three artists doing similar type of stuff, and it's like it just exploded the analog aspect of it where that made that sound almost kind of campy. So these other people like Chick Corea and some of these other people that were geniuses almost fine-tune their sound. And some of it sounds great, some of it sounds a little too digital. Again, you said Pat Metheny, to me it still was a beautiful time period because you still had the musicianship of some of these artists, and that's the era I know that you were kind of coming into.
Right.
But it's almost like someone like Jeff Lorber, and I'm just giving them an example. The people that I mentioned, Jeff Lorber, Herbie Hancock, and Paul Hardcastle, they almost outdated themselves because they were so ahead of their time.
And it was very diverse when you think about it, because you had sort of that big '80s snare sound that you'd hear on pop records and all that kind of stuff. And then you had things that were more organic, like Pat Metheny and his group when he was doing that. And that was a real awesome live ensemble. So I think groups like that, and even some of the bands that maybe are more on the straight ahead side now, like Yellow Jackets,
Yeah, oh
they,
God, those
they came out in
guys.
the early '80s, and Russ Ferrante on piano. So people like that were really influencing me. And on the other hand, there's a lot of pop sensibilities in my background too. I mean, I grew up in kind of a rock and roll town. Cleveland is where I grew up, and so I heard all that music, and that's a part of what I do. And sometimes you wonder, how jazzy should I be? How pop should I be? And you have to learn to let the music kind of lead you, and you kind of have to be true to yourself. So that's what I've been trying to do with these newer releases. We did New York Stories that came out, and I think the music, is pretty strong. So I'm happy with that. But it's all about change and evolving as a musician, isn't it?
And going back to your first album, or actually Dust to Dawn, it was like I said, it almost fit into those other
I'm
categories that I.
impressed. I'm impressed that you know that name.
Well, it's just because we have it
That's
on our station, and again, I
yeah,
I have catalogs. I go through catalogs of what we have, and back in those days, you had to curate your own list, and to think of what will get people talking at. Just for instance, when they're having cocktail hour, and it's like, hey, let me
yeah,
throw Russ Freeman and some of your songs, and still to this day, as a radio broadcaster and on our channel, I grew through albums, and I'll pick single songs. If it's a full album that has a full match, it's kind of rare. It's not that the music's not good. It's just sometimes because of the artists themselves, it's like the scope is so broad on different albums. Again, Dust
right.
to Dawn hits on a lot of the different old school levels where your current music right now, it's almost like you have the same sensibility as the artist that you obviously have been through the years, but it's like a new path, so to speak, because I do
Yeah,
hear all these different things in there. Like we talked about some of the bossa nova sounds that you're using and
yeah,
some of these different things. And it's almost like you're now this like bona fide clay artist that is like now you're making different pottery, so to speak, versus like
right.
coffee mugs and plates.
Yeah.
That's the best way to
Well,
describe it.
I do appreciate that you, and obviously you're an expert kind of listener with your experience and your position in the industry, but that, you're able to pick up those differences. It's something that as a creator or content maker or producer, whatever you want to say I am, that I'm not as good of a judge of, I mean, like I'm sort of here doing my thing. I'm trying to be creative, but I'm not sure how the listener's going to take things. And I don't think anybody really knows for sure. There are songs that for some reason just blow up and nobody's exactly sure why. So there's a little bit of mysticism in this whole process of trying to be an artist.
I can understand that. And also, I think what you've done really well is you haven't done the full on album releases. It's almost like it's too much because you put so much effort. And I don't mean you, but it seems like a lot of artists now are just doing one, two songs, one, six,
Right.
again. And I think it's better because it allows you to dance with whatever trends might be there and what might not be there versus putting a full fledged album. And I think this says a lot as the artist too. I understand how it is. You put so much effort behind your music, and then just to hear see no engagement or to not get anything out of it when you work so hard on this. So it's almost like you want to throw a pebble onto the water to see if it skips. And if it skips, cool. If it doesn't, no harm, no foul. Off to the next song because you're going to keep creating whether the 10 songs people listen to it or not. Because that's what you do. That's what you're built to do. So I think
Yeah.
that's the difference that I see more with your current releases. It's smart, is what I'm saying. Is like you've adapted very well.
Well, I thank you for that. I'm sure that you're noticing obviously these huge changes in the industry. If you look back over the last 5, 10 years, it's so different. And the consumer experience is totally different. Whether you're talking about entertainment in the form of video or audio or so many levels, it's just all changed. And I think one of the things that has happened is that artists like me, let's say those artists that are, not the biggest superstars, but they're regularly putting out music and getting some commercial releases on the charts. There's many of us, and many of the productions are really competitive. They sound really good. But the sheer volume of what's being uploaded to Spotify on a daily basis is pretty staggering. So to get your space on the shelf, so to speak, is a real challenge. You have the opportunity to upload music and get it out there, but it's definitely an ocean of music that you're kind of competing in as an artist. So I think that speaks to why so many artists are moving towards more of a singles oriented approach. Once you're established at a certain level, obviously people want to hear albums. But I think for the artists that are mid level artists or newer artists or what have you, there's a hesitancy to put 10 new songs right out on Spotify or whatever streaming service. And then just those songs are kind of old and they're not necessarily getting promoted. Whereas with single after single, kind of what we did with New York Stories, we released Maria and Blue and Herbie and We Were in Love with Randy Brecker. All those songs were released 6 months or so or a year before New York Stories came out. So the EP really was, like you said earlier, all the songs were there already. The artist is hesitant to put a lot of material out without full promotional opportunities.
Yeah, is that reference to Herbie Hancock or Herbie Mann?
It's a reference to Herbie Hancock. There's
Okay.
actually a video that we did on YouTube, which is kind of neat. It's an animated thing, and it sort of does a little bit of a biography of Herbie. So it starts visually showing him with the Miles Davis group, and
Okay.
then he's doing his thing a little bit later on in the 70s playing on Soul Train. There's a clip of that, and it's all integrated. So if people want to check it out, it's on YouTube. It's called Herbie by Ultrablue.
Yeah, I need to definitely check it out. So that way I know what's going on because it actually sounds interesting. And now you're adding a
Yeah,
different aspect where you added animation. And again,
yeah,
as an artist, and like, I mean, there's so many people that do different things. And I know that taking essentially 20 years off in between, it's not that you've taken 20 years off, like not learning and growing, but it sounds like with your education experience through that time as a teacher, that the students helped influence you as well.
yeah. I think that, and I've always been a busy musician. I've always been working on the New York scene, doing tons of gigs, doing projects with people. The Ultra Blue brand it was just kind of on the shelf. I was really proud of the albums that we did, the '03 and the '06. And a lot of people remember the '06 album, which is really nice. But it's funny how fast the years go by. And, one day I'm thinking, and this was around the time when I retired, I was like, what should I do next specifically as a musician? And, there were, as I say, some experimentations, working with some different group combinations and things like that. Not everything works perfectly. It's a making the sausage kind of deal. Sometimes the end result is really pretty, but it takes a while to get there. And for me, I thought the Ultra Blue thing was worth continuing because it gives me opportunities as a writer, as a player, as a producer, and a chance to kind of share and work with some really great musicians. And I've always been interested in reaching people. I don't want to make something that nobody hears. I'd like to make some music that people do hear and enjoy. And that's kind of the goal with Ultra Blue.
And I'm glad that I got to meet you and talk with you just over the past couple of months and learn more about you person to person. It's different when you read someone's stories, and it's almost like I get this sense of like superstardom when I start talking to people. So when you put a face to a name, I didn't realize, like, I was like, oh my God, this is the guy from Ultra Blue. Like, I was just looking at
Yeah.
this album the other day. So to hear your story is not only phenomenal, but it leads me into the next question. What was it like when you're behind the desk of the classroom or and you're up there teaching? Did any of the students even connect anything, or was it just like a new batch every year? I mean, what was that like?
Yeah, well, honestly, I mean, I was both in the teaching world and then in the teaching world as an administrator. So I went from being a teacher to actually being a school principal. And I can tell you that it was a pretty intense job and it was very different. And I wasn't sure how much to integrate the two lives, because sometimes there's a perception like he's really just a musician doing this job or vice versa. And I always tried to pour myself into whatever I do 100%. So I didn't really talk a lot about that. I did do maybe some musical performances at the school and things like that, and kids love that. But they were separate worlds. And I could tell you that it's just really interesting as an older artist now. I'm looking at it from being an older person compared to when I started. And the goal is to walk the path of the artist. And, I've put myself in a position to have the time to do it. It's a great challenge. And I hope that my artistry continues to evolve.
Well, it definitely has evolved, and I think what with your journey that you've done, and just already says more about the people behind jazz music, because you go to jazz concerts or you go to jazz events or you talk to the people that are behind jazz. It's a more sophisticated understanding, a sophisticated education, a sophisticated level of what it is to get people there. Most people that are listening to regular music, pop music, they don't have the sophistication of listenership to understand what goes behind jazz because they're more interested in something that's so mass produced. I'm going to give an example of someone, and I'm not knocking the artist, but like someone like Post Malone, great performer, charismatic, all that stuff. But they release albums and they drop 32 songs. And then they do another one and it's another 32
Yeah.
songs 6 months later. And it's a bunch of different styles, which is great. But they reach their mass market. Everything is about marketability. Who can they market to? And how can you get it on all the platforms at the Super Bowl, on a commercial? How I can get
Yeah.
it literally. And I'm just bringing up another artist. Taylor Swift, every song that she's released on her current album is in the top 30. So literally, they design albums specifically that all 10 tracks, all of them chart, which wasn't heard of in the days. So
Right. Right.
going with that mentality and these two artists that I mentioned that are more popular to like the common average person, when you take a step back and you think about the more sophisticated listener, you start seeing just the educational level of the people that are producing the music, what that takes.
The realities of as a musician and they're very challenging. People are still playing gigs in New York for like $100. And $100 feels like what a $20 bill used to feel like.
Got that right.
It goes real quick. So it's always a balancing act between commerce and creativity, between paying bills and how far out do you want to go on a risk. I've admired and look up to some of those artists that have put it all out there and have never done anything. They've done anything but music. For me, it didn't work out that way. I did have to have a day gig. A lot of musicians have had that. And I think the challenge for me now is, again, as somebody who's now retired from their day job and is on the older side, of the business to try to maintain the energy and the focus and continue to grow and maybe become a better artist than I've ever been before is a fun challenge.
And I'm just bringing up another artist, Adam Hawley, who's
Oh, yeah.
current. He's a PhD in guitar, okay? He was playing
Yeah.
gigs, I think even last year for $50. So again, I don't think people understand like when you go out to the Costco and you drop $300, you're not even giving a quarter of that to go see an artist perform. So put that into perspective, listeners. And so
Right.
when someone says, "Oh, well, he didn't make it in music," yeah, well, you know what? It's easier for you to be a critic. Artists rely on the support of us as the consumers, us meaning you and I, but also we're also the people behind it. I don't make a penny on Pacific Coast Radio. I don't do advertising. I don't want advertising. I don't want commercials. That way I can do things on my own. And
Right.
everything's out of pocket. So realistically, all things are a business. Time is money, right? You're in the recording
Yeah.
studio. You have to pay for that unless you do it yourself. And it's still time is money
Yeah.
because you're producing your own
Totally.
stuff. So for those that sit there and listen and flip something on and off because they're not interested, think a little bit more about what you're doing. If you are listening, if you are that sophisticated to say, hey, someone put their time and money into this. And I know AI is a big thing right now. Oh, well, AI can do
Yeah.
that.
Well, we talked about changes in the industry, both from your side of the industry and from the content creation side of it. Now, people that really don't have production skills have access to AI, and they're putting together arrangements and things like this
Hmm.
that are credible. I actually have a friend in LA. She's a songwriter, and she sent me some material with a finished band production that sounded like a record. That was all slapped together. I'm not putting it down, but I'm just
Yeah.
saying it compared to the musician who's creating the bass line or playing the guitar part or whatever it might be. Um, it's a whole different mentality. So it offers advantages, the new technologies, but it also offers new challenges. And musicians have always had challenges being valued, even back to the greats from years ago. There's always been a struggle to make money. So that's a reality. And I think you must do what you're doing because you love it and because of the passion that you have for it. And that's kind of the same story for me with what I do.
You know what keeps me going are people such as yourself. And it's the person's ability of listening to stories, background stories. And I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued because I'm still, at the end of the day, I am interested in when you're saying some of the people that you played with, special effects people, and all this stuff, because that's music that when I was in elementary, junior high, high school, that was like the above music. And
Yeah,
again, I mean, in my era, it was like the pop artists were like, Michael Jackson and Paula
sure.
Abdul, Janet Jackson, which to me still are like the peak. But when you
The
hear
80s.
some of these artists that were like making it in that time, for me, I'm still a fan, in other words. So to touch base with some people like yourselves that have worked in the trenches, so to speak, with some of these artists, that's
Yeah.
what's fascinating, and that you're still doing things. So I think more for people like me, it's just because there's a necessity still that somebody wants you around, so to speak. So
Music is a thing that we're motivated by a certain passion. And I'm sure that you feel this way too. Music's sometimes it's a lifesaver. It's a therapy. It's a way of emotionally being affected. No other art form can do it this way. So I think we all get hooked. You were probably a kid at some point hearing radio, and that probably had a certain magic. And it did for me too. I mean, I can remember being a kid and hearing a certain record and a certain day and just it seemed like a magical thing. So that's part of the whole thing for me. It's not just scales and chords and stuff. It's this bigger thing, this sort of passion that we grew up with for music in our culture.
same with the broadcasters themselves. You're always fascinated by the Dick Clarks and the Casey Kasems,
Oh yeah,
as
right.
a broadcaster, and I'm never going to be that. It's not that I can't. It's just it's a different era. That's like saying, "Hey, I'm going to be like Dave Brubeck." It's like, well, no, like different
Right.
times, different eras. Also, those guys are all dead. And also, too, people just don't listen to the one medium anymore. But you hear their storytelling styles, you hear the way they presented things. And it's always great to look back at those eras of radio. If you look at the songs and the artists, you see who produced it, where it was recorded, who the
Yeah.
distributor was. And if you look at those things, which I think I'm positive you did, which I did, then you start connecting the names. And I think that's what goes into the backgrounds of some of these people in the trenches that when I look, I'm like, oh, shoot, Clea Minucci and David
Yeah.
Mann and like I'm going back to Herbie Man when I saw the name Herbie, and it's like,
Yeah,
Herbie Man was a pioneer of smooth jazz, with flute, and I think he's overlooked because he's been dead for a while. And these are
right.
unsung heroes, so to speak. And jazz has always been the unsung hero of the music industry, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always a challenge doing instrumental music to capture an audience compared to vocal music. That's just a given, right? I'm a pianist first and foremost. So if you listen to the newer Ultra Blue, you definitely hear a lot of piano, probably more than you heard on the 2006 album, although the piano was there consistently. But I've kind of made a conscious effort to emphasize my piano on the tracks. Having said that, there's still a band sensibility about it. So I think that speaks to what you said earlier about some of the subtle changes in the music over time and over the years.
Like I said, two different eras. Back then, you were more of an ensemble. Now it's like you're the leader, and now it's driven off of what you're writing. So, and that's what I picture as well.
There's a couple other musicians that are the new music that I'd like to mention. One's Joel Rosenblatt. Joel has been the drummer with Spyro Gyra. He also has worked with, I believe, Michelle Camillo, the pianist, and special effects as well. So, having the opportunity to work with somebody like that, or Pete Velasco, I don't know if you know Pete or not, great multi instrumentalist, great songwriter, and he's played a guest role on a number of our tracks. Played on a tune called Oasis. Played on a remake we did of The Summer Knows, which was a beautiful rendition. David Mann was also on that, and now he's on the new album. Well, actually, it's not on the album yet, but it's a single, Something Like Summer, and Pete plays on that one as well. So just the opportunity to work with these kinds of great musicians is another motivator, another blessing for me.
Are there any plans on doing any performances as Ultra Blue or with Ultra Blue or with some kind of a live
Yeah, I
setup?
think that's been a goal. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but we're currently working with a company that is nationally known, and we're working on trying to get bookings. That's a process. It doesn't just happen like this, and it's a little bit more challenging because the first thing that agents are going to ask is, well, which rooms have you played and how many people were there? That's kind of their world and what motivates them. So it's chicken and egg. You could have a great group, but to get things started is one of the most difficult things. And Ultra Blue had not performed live ever until actually earlier this year. So we're looking at new opportunities. I would like nothing more, Mike, than to be able to go around the world from time to time and play my music. That would be an unbelievable thing to do. So hopefully that's in the future.
Of course, of course. And what I've
Yeah,
noticed also too with artists such as Ultra Blue, it's almost like you want to make the super group because now you're inviting the other people of inclusive musicians that are performing on this one gig. So again, I'm just mentioning Adam Hawley, where he has Jason Jackson and he has Cat Hawley, and it's like you want to
yeah.
show up your best, but you also want your other friends to work too. It's also putting up a room, right? It's like, hey, let me see if I can get something and book it. And I don't think people realize that. They think, oh, well, you don't tour because whatever. No, no, no. There's a lot that goes behind it.
And finding your groove in whatever you're doing, there's no exact manual for it, right? You have to experiment. You have certain circumstances. We tend to work alone, both in broadcast and in production. We're sort of in silos being creative. Yeah, there are times where it's a lot of collaboration, but there are times, especially as a writer, where it's a lot of solitary work. So that's another interesting dynamic in music, is trying to balance that, ability to collaborate with others with your own need to just write and produce new material.
What do you got currently working right now on your palette?
Well, we have a new single that's going to come out in February, and it was the first time that I've turned production duties over to an outside producer. So there's another producer credited. His name's Jeffrey Carruthers. Jeffrey has an incredible track record in the industry. I mean, he's worked with many of the top smooth jazz stars, and he has a certain gravitas. I wanted to try to expand the Ultra Blue brand, and it was an attempt to work with a different producer. And the song's called Storm. I'm going to send it to you, Mike, ahead of time, but it's actually going to come out somewhere in the middle of February. So it's going to be another slightly different sound. I think it fits right into the smooth jazz format, and that's another topic. But if you are not attentive to it, you can produce some music that starts to veer too far away from the commercial side of contemporary jazz. There's sort of a place there where it has to connect with the listeners, hit the chorus, do everything like a pop record does in about 4 minutes. So that's an art in itself to kind of confine and shape your music as a jazz musician into this kind of commercial sensibility. You risk being called a sellout if you go too commercial, but you're aware that your music is in a commercial market. And so you do want to think about, maintaining listeners as well as expanding your listenership. So I think with this new song, I'll be interested to what you think of it when it comes out with a new producer. A lot of what's there, I actually produced the original demo, but there were some live players in LA that were added and things like that. So that's the next one coming out. And we'll have a new EP at the least. There's enough music for a new album already, but we may not do a full album. We may do another EP again. So I don't have a date for that yet. And there's, quite a few new songs ready to go. So I'm looking forward to the
Yeah, Jeffrey Carruthers, you're going down Dave Cause Avenue. So
yeah, he's worked with all those guys, Paul Brown's one of
and
his
that's
best
okay.
friends. So,
That tells you
yeah,
where you're going. And now, you're just trying things out. Just like anything else back in the days of the 70s and 80s, where like, oh, well, we got to work with Quincy Jones and now we got to use these session cats. It's engulfing that into to see what it does for you. Where
right.
is your song being played outside of Pacific Coast Radio? Or well, are you on Sirius XM or what's going on with that?
Yeah, so that's interesting that you brought up Sirius. So Sirius XM, as far as I know, has not played our music yet. And there are some people that I'm working with, on the team, so to speak, people that I advertise with, people that are in the smooth jazz industry, in broadcasters and so forth. And we've discussed this. There's no way to know for sure in mind on watercolors. Jeffrey's got a lot of records that have been successful in that venue. Something like Summer was a top 20 song, according to smoothjazz.com, which is one of the main charts. And there are some stations that don't play it, so you never know for sure who picks what and why, but you reach out and you do your thing and you hope that people give it a try and that it resonates with them.
Smoothjazz.com, Smooth Jazz Global, Smooth Jazz
Right.
Network. They're all different umbrellas, even though they kind of
Yeah.
overlap. But there's jazz stations that are on terrestrial radio that have no idea who I just mentioned and who you just mentioned. And
Correct.
again, I'm glad to be a part of both of those networks, being like a flagship and just being associated with them because we do get a lot of music from them and I get a lot of people contacting. But there's still so much work to do. And I think that's because jazz is still overall like an untapped market, so to speak. And I know about watercolors. Seems like they play the same 30 songs kind of type of thing. And
Yeah.
so,
It's again, it's a bit of a mystery why a certain programmer selects certain records. They're going to play Adam Hawley, they're going to play Dave Koz, Paul Brown, Brian Culbertson. There's certain artists, there's more, that are almost guaranteed, but not always, to have a top 10 hit. For artists like Ultrablue that, many people haven't heard of us yet, despite having, 3 albums or so, despite having all these singles, it takes a while to sort of break through. I think an analogy might be there's a restaurant in your town. It's been there 3, 4 years. People are just finding out about it. They have to weather the storm of, yeah, we're here to stay and we're going to keep putting out great meals. And then people start discovering it. And I think for Ultrablue and other artists that are trying to reach the audience, that's the challenge.
well, everyone, check out John Smatla's Ultrablue. They have a number of different songs on Pacific Coast Radio, including Heartland, The Girl with the Sunflower Tattoo, Indiscretions, Soul Candy, Something Like Summer, which features Gabriella Andrews and Pete Velasco. And you can check them out. They're on streaming platforms everywhere. And I'm sure if you do a search on them, you're going to find some of their great music. And believe me, it's worth listening to. John, I just want to thank you for joining me here on the Dockmaster Mike Radio Show and the Dockmaster Mike Music Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in.